فرأس العلم تقوى الله حقا وليس بأن يقال لقد رأست.
وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد. Proceed. The best of speech is the speech of Allah Azza wa Jal, and the best of guidance is the guidance of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the worst of all affairs are those affairs that have newly been added into the religion. Everything newly added into the religion is an innovation, and every innovation is a misguidance, and every misguidance is in the fire of hell. By the praise of Allah, we continue our reading tonight from قواعد مهمة في الأسماء والصفات by Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen حفظه الله تعالى. As we discussed before, this is meant to be an introduction to the science, the discipline of the names and attributes of Allah Jalla fi Ulah, to prepare those who are dealing with this science, with this discipline for the first time, or those who need the foundations and principles found here before we proceed to go into a commentary on Al-Lamiyah. Inshallah, we hope to conclude our reading of this treatise or this intro by Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen tonight, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And from the next class, we will begin with the Lamiyah itself. We are with the third principle. And the third principle is regarding the attributes of Allah Jalla wa'ala. The author, rahimahullah ta'ala, said, القاعدة الثالثة في صفات الله. Third principle regarding the attributes, the descriptions of Allah. وتحتها فروع أيضا. And underneath this principle there are branches as well. الفرع الأول. First branch. صفات الله كلها عليا. صفات كمال ومدح ليس فيها نقص بوجه من الوجوه. The attributes of Allah, all of them, are lofty attributes of perfection and praise. There is no lacking in them in any way or shape or fashion. Then the Shaykh begins to give examples of these things that we call attributes, these descriptions of Allah. He said, كالحياة والعلم والقدرة والسمع والبصر والحكمة والرحمة والعلو وغير ذلك. في قوله تعالى ولله المثل الأعلى. He gives examples and then he brings the proof. What is the proof for this? The examples are al-haya, life. Allah is described with having life, with being alive. Wal-ilm, Allah is described with having ilm, knowledge. Qudra, power. Allah is described as having power. Sam', hearing. Allah is described as having hearing. Al-basar, having sight. Hikmah, having wisdom. Al-rahmah, having mercy. Al-ulu, being lofty, being high, being majestic. وغير ذلك, and other than Allah, than that, and other than that. All of these are considered descriptions of Allah or attributes, if you wish. And the evidence is the statement of Allah تبارك وتعالى وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, and to Allah belongs the loftiest descriptions. Scholars of tafsir, commenting on this statement of Allah وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, they said these are the meaning of this is that it is the descriptions of Allah are the highest. Out of every description, Allah has the most distinguished of it, the highest of it, the greatest of it. Out of every attribute, Allah Azza wa Jal is described with the best of it. This is the meaning of وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. Then the Shaykh gives a second reason. He said, وَلَإِنَّ الرَّبَّ كَامِلٌ, because the Lord is perfect. وَوَجَبَ كَمَالُ صِفَاتِهِ, and if He's perfect, that means His attributes must be perfect. He cannot be perfect if His attributes are imperfect. وإذا كانت الصفة نقصا لا كمال فيها فهي ممتنعة في حقه كالموت. Now the Shaykh moves on to a different type of descriptions. These are descriptions that are considered descriptions of a flaw, that contain no perfection in them. Descriptions of a flaw that contain no perfection in them, then in that case, هي ممتنعة في حق الله. Then it is impossible for Allah to be described with such a description. It would be entirely false to describe Allah with something like that. Then he gave examples. كالموت والجهل والعجز والصمم والعمى ونحو ذلك. Like death. Death and ignorance and ineptitude and deafness and blindness and the like of that. All of these descriptions, they fit this criteria. The criteria that they indicate a lacking. They indicate a flaw. There's no completion. There's no perfection in such a description. If Allah Azza wa Jal was described as dead, there's no perfection in that. It is only a lacking. It is only a weakness. There is no strength or perfection in that. As such, every description that fits this criteria is false if Allah Azza wa Jal is described with it. It is unbefitting for a slave to describe Allah with such. The Shaykh gives a reason. He says, لأنه سبحانه عاقب الواصفين له بالنقص. What's the evidence that Allah is not to be described with these things? Or another piece of evidence why Allah is not to be described with these things. He said, because He has punished those who describe Him with lacking. Those who describe Allah with any kind of shortcoming, Allah Azza wa Jal punishes them. What's an example that we've recently seen? During this class, we talked about some verses that pertain to the Jews. What is an example of this? Maybe someone can remind us what is found in these verses that talk about the Jews and how Allah Azza wa Jal punished them for describing Him with a lacking. Center. This is the correct answer. When the Jews described Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with being greedy, stingy, not spending. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished them by cursing them subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He Jalla wa ala afflicted them with the same thing that they accused Him of Azza wa Jal. He made them stingy and greedy to the point that you will see one of them in need of spending on his own self for years. He will refrain from spending on his own self and suffer greatly. And yet they cannot bring themselves to spend on their own selves, despite being very wealthy by the standards of the people around them. SubhanAllah, this is a tremendous punishment that Allah afflicted upon them for describing Him with that which is unbefitting of His majesty and greatness, Jalla wa ala. So this is one evidence that Allah punishes those who speak ill of Him. ونزه نفسه عما يصفونه به من النقائص. Allah Azza wa Jal has also exalted Himself above the shortcomings that they attribute to Him. Meaning, it is also an evidence that Allah Azza wa Jal frees Himself. He frees Himself. He exalts Himself above that which they attribute to Him of these shortcomings. The same example we just talked about right now, Allah Jalla wa ala also said, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ. Rather, His two hands are extended. He spends how He pleases, how He wants, how He wills. Jalla wa ala يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. His two hands are extended and He spends how He wants. So Allah Azza wa Jalla defends Himself. Allah Jalla wa ala clarifies the truth about Himself, refutes the falsehood that they are spreading about Him. Jalla wa ala. This is another proof that none of the descriptions of flaws that are attributed to Allah Azza wa Jalla by His enemies are true. In fact, Allah Jalla wa ala mentioned those who think ill of Him. Allah mentioned those who think ill of Him. He said, الظَّانِّينَ بِاللَّهِ ظَنَّ السَّوْءِ. Those who think of Allah ill thoughts. And then Allah said, عَلَيْهِمْ دَائِرَةُ السَّوْءِ. The evil outcome is for them. وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. And Allah's wrath is upon them. وَلَعَنَهُمْ. And He cursed them. وَأَعَدَّ لَهُمْ جَهَنَّمْ. And He has prepared Jahannam, the deep fire, for them. وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. And what an ill fate it is. Some of the scholars, when they read this sequence of punishments, they said, I've never heard Allah speaking with such harsh words to any of His creation, except for those who think ill of Him, showing us exactly how big of a crime it is to think ill of Allah. And what the Muslims are being taught from day one of our Islam is that Allah is praiseworthy from every angle. Allah is praiseworthy in every way. Allah is praiseworthy for everything, for His names, for His attributes, for His actions. He is praiseworthy in what He does, and He is praiseworthy in Himself. This is the meaning of the statement that every Muslim learns from day one. Alhamdulillah. All praise belongs to Allah. All praise cannot belong to Allah if He is also to be dispraised from some angle. So if someone dispraises Allah Azza wa Jal, then they don't believe. Then they do not believe that Alhamdulillah, all praise belongs to Allah, is deserved by Allah Jalla wa Ala. The author gave one more reason. He said, وَلِأَنَّ الرَّبَّ لَا يُمْكِنُ أَنْ يَكُونَ نَاقِصًا لِمُنَافَاةِ النَّقْصِ لِلرُّبُوبِيَّةِ ولأن الرب لا يمكن أن يكون ناقصا لمنافاة النقص للربوبية. And because the Lord cannot be incomplete, cannot be deficient, because deficiencies are contradictory to lordship. He cannot be a lord, a god, a deity, and have deficiencies. These two things do not go together. To be a deity, to be worthy of worship, means that He's not deficient in any way. So these are three reasons he gave why Allah Azza wa Jal cannot be described with any description. No attribute can be attached to Him Jalla wa Ala that is an attribute of a deficiency, a shortcoming, or a flaw. I hope this is clear. And if it is, we can move on to the next type. Jamil. Even if there are any issues, inshallah, we can tackle them in the questions after class. The Shaykh then goes on to mention a third type. He says, وَإِذَا كَانَتِ الصِّفَةُ كَمَالًا مِنْ وَجْهٍ وَنَقْصًا مِنْ وَجْهٍ لم تكن ثابتة لله ولا ممتنعة عليه على سبيل الإطلاق بل لا بد من التفصيل. This is very important. He said if the attribute in question is considered perfection when you look at it from one angle, but if you look at it from a different angle, it is considered a deficiency, a flaw, then in that case we do not affirm it to Allah, nor do we reject it and negate it from Allah. And this is when we are talking ala sabil al-itlaq, when we're talking with generalities. You can neither completely affirm it for Allah or completely deny and reject it from Allah. Why? Because some part of it is perfection and some part of it is a deficiency. So you cannot take either stance. What the Shaykh said is the obligation is a tafsil. You have to give a detailed position regarding these types of attributes. The examples will make this very clear, inshallah ta'ala. The Shaykh said, فَتَثْبُتُ لِلَّهِ فِي الْحَالِ الَّتِي تَكُونُ كَمَالًا وَتَمْتَنِعُ عَلَيْهِ فِي الْحَالِ الَّتِي تَكُونُ نَقْصًا. So we affirm it for Allah when it is considered perfection. And we negate it, we deny it, we reject it when it is considered a deficiency or a flaw that is being attributed to Allah Jalla wa Ala. Examples: كالمكر والكيد والخداع ونحوها, like plotting and scheming, like plotting and scheming and deceiving and the like of these things. These attributes, هذه الصفات تكون كمالا إذا كانت في مقابلة مثلها. These attributes are considered perfection when they are a response to the exact same action. In other words, if your enemies attempt to deceive you and you deceive them, and you succeed in deceiving them, then this is a mark of perfection. This is considered strength. This is considered treating the enemies with fairness and justice and defeating them with the same weapon that they tried to employ against you. This is considered strength and perfection. نعم. لأنها تدل على أن فاعلها ليس بعاجز عن مقابلة عدوه بمثل فعله. Why is this considered perfection? Because it gives an indication that the one who has done it, the one who has achieved it, is not incapable, is not inept, is not too weak to respond with the same as that which they are attacked with by their enemies. Your enemies are attacking you with a particular method or weapon, and you can respond with the exact same method and weapon and defeat them. This is a mark of strength, perfection. The Shaykh then gives the other side. He says, وَتَكُونُ نَقْصًا فِي غَيْرِ هَذِهِ الْحَالِ. Other than that, it is considered what? A deficiency. Plotting and scheming generally is a deficiency. Deceiving is generally a deficiency. But not when it is employed in the face of enemies that are attempting to use it against you. In that case, it is considered a just punishment for enemies that are trying to plot and scheme against you, that are trying to deceive you. So, in this case, فتثبت لله في الحال الأولى دون الثاني. In this case, we affirm it for Allah in the first instance, but not in the second. And when it is rightful to employ these methods, Allah employs them, and it is considered perfection. And when it is unrightful to employ these methods, and it is a deficiency, Allah Azza wa Jal is not to be described with them. قال الله تعالى, Allah lofty He said, وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. And they plot, and Allah plots, and Allah is the best of plotters. إِنَّهُمْ يَكِيدُونَ كَيْدًا وَأَكِيدُ كَيْدًا. Another verse. Indeed, they scheme, a scheming, and I scheme, a scheming. As you can see, both instances, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is responding to what? To the work of His enemies by punishing them with the same thing that they are trying to do of their evil. إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُم. Another verse. Indeed, the hypocrites are engaging in deceiving Allah, and Allah is the one to deceive them. And Allah is the one to deceive them. Then the Shaykh said, إِلَى غَيْرِ ذَلِكَ. Two other than that, meaning every evidence of this type, then you are supposed to understand it with these parameters. This is something that Allah is to be described with only when it is considered perfection, only when it is praiseworthy, but not generally speaking. We do not describe Allah Azza wa Jal with these generally. The Shaykh then will present a question, and this question should, inshallah, make this perfectly clear for all of us to understand. The question, he says, is فَإِذَا قِيلَ هَلْ يُوصَفُ اللَّهُ بِالْمَكْرِ مَثَلًا. So if it is said, should Allah be described with plotting and scheming? For example, let's pose this question to all of us. Let's all think about this question. You don't have to type an answer, but let's just ponder over it. Can Allah be described with plotting and scheming? Based on what we just learned right now. Try to employ what you've just learned right now in order to answer this question. Somebody posed a question to you. Should Allah be described with plotting, scheming? Shaykh said, فَلَا تَقُلْ نَعَمْ. Do not say yes. وَلَا تَقُلْ لَا. And do not say no. طيب. We just learned that we're supposed to answer how? Not with yes and no, not with black and white, but rather we should answer with details. We should give a detailed answer. So the answer should be ولكن قل هو ماكر بمن يستحق ذلك الله أعلم. Rather, you should answer and say, he plots against those who deserve that he plots against them, and Allah knows best. Shaykh, may Allah have mercy upon him, finished off his answer by saying, and Allah knows best, referring the knowledge back to Allah Jalla wa Ala. This is something that we should take a lesson from. When you're talking about Allah Jalla wa Ala, you should recognize the limits of your knowledge. And always recognize that Allah Jalla wa Ala is the one who knows best about himself. And when you're dealing with this kind of a topic, you should deal with it with a lot of care and concern, carefulness, and meticulously, and avoid making blanket statements. We are talking about Allah Jalla wa Ala. What the Shaykh said here is, say that he deceives or he plots against those who deserve it. This is an example of an ideal answer. But obviously, as we've seen from the principle, there are multiple ideal answers. As long as you're describing Allah with this description, where it is considered praiseworthy. You're not describing Allah with this description, where it is considered a deficiency, a lacking, a shortcoming. This praise, then in that case, you are answering correctly. This is the answer to the question. Can Allah be described with being plotting or scheming or deceptive? Branch number 2. Do we need to repeat anything that we've already mentioned from branch number 1? Or should we, inshallah, proceed if everything is clear? بارك الله فيكم. Branch number 2, الفرع الثاني. صفات الله تنقسم إلى قسمين: ثبوتية وسلبية. ثبوتية وسلبية. The attributes of Allah fall into 2 categories. Those that we affirm and those that we negate, or those that are affirmed, those that are negated. What is meant here, in very simple terms, things that we have found Allah Azza wa Jal describing himself with. These are affirmed. Things that we have found that Allah Azza wa Jal is freeing himself from. Allah is telling us that this does not apply to him. He's not to be described with it. And these are things that are negated. These are things that are rejected, denied. ثبوتية ما أثبتها الله لنفسه كالحياة والعلم والقدرة ويجب إثباتها لله على الوجه اللائق به لأن الله أثبتها لنفسه وهو أعلم بصفاته. ثبوتية, the ones that are affirmed, are the ones that Allah described himself with, that Allah affirmed for himself, like life, and knowledge, and power. Allah described himself with all these things. Allah Azza wa said, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayy. Allah, there is no God in truth but He, al-hayy, the ever-living. He affirmed to himself life. He said, وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى الْحَيِّ الَّذِي لَا يَمُوتُ. And rely upon the ever-living who never dies. He described himself with life. Al-ilm, Allah Azza wa Jal described himself with knowledge. Allahu bi kulli shay'in alim. Allah is most knowledgeable of everything. Allah is most knowledgeable of everything. Qudra, Allah described himself with power. Wallahu ala kulli shay'in qadir. And Allah is all capable over everything. Allah is all capable over everything. All of these things are things that Allah has affirmed for himself. Allah has described himself with. These are called what? Sifatun thubutiyya. The Shaykh gives us a principle How do we deal with these? He says يجب إثباتها لله على الوجه اللائق به. You have to affirm them to Allah in a manner that is befitting of Allah. In a manner that is what? Befitting of Allah. Why? Because Allah has affirmed them for Himself and He knows Himself more than any. He knows Himself more than any. If Allah has described Himself with these, affirm them, accept them, adopt them, embrace them, believe in them, and make sure you do so in a way that is befitting of Allah's majesty and greatness. We shall see a little bit more detail about this, inshallah, as we keep moving forward. Now, compare this obligation, this duty that the Shaykh has reminded us of, that every Muslim has, to the behavior of some of the people of innovation. Some of the people of innovation have actually made statements. They have actually said this out of their own mouths. That there are particular texts of the Quran and the Sunnah that they wish that they could erase. Imagine that, a Muslim saying that there is an ayah in the Quran or more that he wished he could erase, so that no one would ever see it again, no one would ever lay eyes on it again, no one would ever read it from a minbar any day after that, or anyone would recite it in a salah. Imagine that. What kind of Islam is this? What kind of understanding is this? What kind of deen is this? That they wish to delete some of the revelation that Allah Azza wa Jal has sent down upon Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Are these people at peace with the revelation of Allah? Are these people pleased with Allah Azza wa Jal as their Lord and their guider? Are these people okay with the Quran and they believe in its supremacy and that the Quran is infallible and mistake-free? If anything, these wishes that they have expressed indicate very clearly that they are upon misguidance manifest. No one speaks like that till they have gone very far astray. But the issue is this: there are followers who follow them, people who laud them, people who praise them and speak of them as very highly accomplished scholars and people of knowledge and insight. And yet this is their demeanor with the book of Allah Azza wa Jalla and the Sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this shows us, brothers and sisters, how far removed people have become from the true faith, the faith that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam left his ummah. Now, the Shaykh then moves on to as-salbiyya, sifat as-salbiyya, the things that Allah Azza wa Jal has denied, rejected, has freed Himself from. He said, هي التي نفاها الله عن نفسه كالظلم. These are the things that Allah Azza wa Jal has freed Himself from, like injustice. Injustice. Allah Azza wa Jal cannot be described with injustice. He has freed Himself from this. Allah Jalla wa Ala said, وَمَا رَبُّكَ بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. And surely your Lord is not one to commit injustice, to be unfair with the slaves. فَيَجِبُ نَفْيُهَا عَنِ اللَّهِ. So it is obligatory to negate them from Allah, to defend Allah against them, to free Allah of them. لأن الله نفاها عن نفسه, because Allah freed Himself from them. لكن, however, pay attention here, because the Shaykh is going to clarify an important point. لكن يجب اعتقاد ثبوت ضدها. It is an obligation to believe that the exact opposite of this is affirmed for Allah. What does this mean? It means that every time you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala freeing Himself of a description, then automatically you ought to believe that He's also affirming the exact opposite for Himself. Right now we talked about Allah as just saying, وَمَا رَبُّكَ بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. And your Lord is not one to commit an injustice against the slaves. We affirm what? that your Lord is forever just. Your Lord is forever just. He is the ultimately just, Azza wa Jal, with his slaves. Your Lord is the Lord of justice, Jalla wa Ala. What's another example of something that Allah Azza wa Jal has freed himself from? And as such, we understand that Allah is describing himself with the exact opposite of a perfection that is diametrically opposed to that flaw. Death. Allah Azza wa Jal said about himself, الذي لا يموت, the one who does not die. What does that mean? Allah Azza wa Jal is forever living. He's always been alive and will continuously remain alive until no end, and that his life is not tainted by anything at all. It's perfect, perfect life. Not tainted by sleep, not tainted by tiredness, not tainted by anything that taints life or diminishes it. His life is complete, perfect. But when it comes to everything that Allah has freed himself from, in order to believe in it properly, you have to also think about its opposite and affirm that for Allah. If Allah Azza wa Jal freed himself from having partners, it means that Allah is not in need of help, that Allah is not in need of partners, that Allah has no one that is equal. So you have to believe in the opposite of that. He Jalla wa Ala is all powerful, he doesn't need help, that he doesn't need partners and helpers. He Azza wa Jal is the one that helps all and supports all. All are in need of him and he is not in need of anyone. And that Allah Jalla wa Ala, just like we said, he freed himself from partners, then he Jalla wa Ala is the one that should be worshipped alone, without any. Now, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, he explains why we have to do this. لأن النفي لا يكون كمالا حتى يتضمن ثبوتا. Because freeing Allah of something, negating something, is not considered perfection until it also includes an affirmation. Let's say, for example, you picked up an object, let's say a rock or a bottle, and you said, this bottle never oppressed me. This bottle never oppressed me. This is a statement of negation. You're negating, you're freeing the bottle of the accusation of having committed what? An injustice. But are you also praising the bottle? Is there praise for the bottle involved in this statement? Obviously not. Right. Obviously not. There's no praise for the bottle in this. Why? Because the bottle is not something that is befitting of praise. The bottle is not something befitting of praise. In other words, if you spoke about your child and you say, my child, let's say they're a 3-year-old, has never stolen money from me. It's not something that is praiseworthy. A 3-year-old is not a child that you think could even possibly steal. There's no praise included. The Arabs used to actually sometimes use these kinds of words. They would play with words like this to actually issue insults. I'll give you an example, the statement of one of the poets where he said, قُبَيِّلَةٌ لَا يَغْدِرُونَ بِذِمَّةٍ وَلَا يَظْلِمُونَ النَّاسَ حَبَّةَ خَرْدَلٍ. A small tribe, a tiny little tribe, that never betray any accords that they enter into, or change the people even a mustard seed of their rights. This may sound like praise until you examine the beginning of the line of poetry where he described them as a tiny little tribe. In other words, he's saying they're so weak and so pathetic and so cowardly that they would never, ever make a mistake. that would then result in people demolishing them and destroying them and completely decimating them. This is what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that they're weak and powerless and cowardly. But he, instead of using such words, it's simply what? Negating that they would ever do anything wrong to anyone. This is what is meant by this line of poetry. So, if you want to praise Allah by negating what Allah has negated in descriptions, that He Azza wa Jal has freed Himself from, then you must include the opposite praise in your belief as you negate it. I hope this is clear. And if it is not, we can examine it further. Otherwise, we can keep moving. Now, if this is understood, bear in mind, there are many people of innovation, many people of innovation who do not believe in this. But when they negate a description from Allah, their negation is ultimate. In other words, it does not include any affirmation of an opposite trait of perfection. So their negation is the same as the negation that is attributed to nothingness. Unlike the people of the Sunnah, they don't believe that Allah is described with the opposite perfection. Rather, they just negate and that's it. They do not affirm any perfection to Allah, but they negate what Allah has negated and free Allah from what He has freed Himself from, but not as an admission of His perfection. In other words, they refuse to admit that Allah is perfect, but they will agree that He's not imperfect. Does that make sense? But in so doing, they have fallen into the exact thing they were trying to flee from. By refusing to admit His perfection and agreeing that He's not imperfect, they have accused Him of being imperfect. If He is not described with any quality of perfection, that automatically makes Him what? Imperfect. تعالى الله عما يقول الظالمون علوا كبيرا. The Shaykh then gave an example. May Allah have mercy upon him. He said, مثال ذلك قوله تعالى ولا يظلم ربك أحدا. The example of this is his statement, lofty is He, and surely your Lord does not transgress against anyone. So it is obligatory, he said, فيجب نفي الظلم عن الله, to free Allah from committing an injustice. مع اعتقاد ثبوت العدل لله على الوجه الأكمل, along with believing that justice is the right description of Allah in its ultimate form. Allah Azza wa Jal is the ultimately just. تبارك وتعالى. الفرع الثالث, the third branch. صفات الثبوتية تنقسم إلى قسمين, ذاتية وفعلية. The traits that we affirm for Allah also can be categorized into two categories. We're now talking about the things that we affirm, that Allah described Himself with. Those can also be categorized into two categories. ذاتية وفعلية. Attributes of the self, attributes of actions. Very simple terms. Attributes of the self and attributes of actions. The self, ذاتية, هي التي لم يزل ولا يزال متصفا بها كالسمع والبصر. كالسمع والبصر. The attributes of the self, the Shaykh gave us a very easy definition. You should just commit this to memory. التي لم يزل ولا يزال متصفا بها. Things that Allah has always been described with and will forever remain described with. And then he gave examples like hearing and seeing. If someone asked you, since when has Allah been hearing and seeing? Since when has Allah been all hearing, all seeing? You're going to say, since forever. And if someone asked you the opposite question, he said, until when? You would say, until forever. It has no beginning and it has no end, just like Allah has no beginning and has no end. Allah has always been described with being all-seeing, hearing. These are attributes of the self. Allah described himself with these things. They are subutiyya, they're affirmed. In addition to this, there are attributes of the self. So Allah himself is described with this in himself. Clear? We can proceed. Let's give a little bit more detail. Sometimes they are described as صفات اللازمة. صفات اللازمة. The traits that are permanent traits of Allah. So this is another term. If you come across this terminology in the speech of the people of knowledge, recognize that it's a reference to the same thing that we're seeing here as صفات ثبوتية ذاتية, permanent traits of Allah. In these صفات that are called ذاتية, attributes of the self, can also be categorized into two categories. We're not going to go into too much detail, inshallah, just very briefly. Those that can only be determined based upon text, attributes of Allah, of himself. It can only be determined based upon text, and others that can be determined based upon others in the text, such as by the sound mind. An example of that which can only be determined based upon the text is that Allah is described as having a hand, or that Allah is described as having fingers, or that Allah is described as having a shin, or that Allah is described as having eyes. All of these things are impossible to determine with certainty, absent revelation from Allah. So they're called صفات ذاتية خبرية. How are they defined? As ذاتية خبرية. خبرية is a reference to al-khabar. Khabar is one of the many synonyms of narration. Narration is a reference to text. You have to have text in order to determine with certainty that Allah has a hand, that Allah has fingers, that Allah has a shin, that Allah has eyes, and so on. Second category. ذاتية معنوية. ذاتية معنوية. معنوية is a reference to things that are abstract, things that are determinable by the sound mind. An example of this is that Allah is knowledgeable. Even absent text, you can find a desert dweller who's never studied anything, never sat in the classes of the people of knowledge. And you will see that they are certain that Allah Azza wa Jal has a tremendous knowledge, immense knowledge. Where did this certainty come from? It comes from having a sound mind. All you have to do is look around you and you see how immensely knowledgeable your Lord Jalla wa Ala is. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. Knowledge is an example of ذاتية معنوية. It is not only reliant upon text in order for us to know about it, learn about it, and affirm it for Allah Jalla wa Ala. Though obviously they are also mentioned in the text and found in them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a shortcut that leads us directly to this knowledge about Him Jalla fi'ula. Now, the Shaykh mentioned the second category. We're going back to the text now. He said, وَالْفِعْلِيَّةِ, those that relate to the actions of Allah. We're all on the same page, inshallah. Keep on going. بارك الله فيكم. فعلية هي التي تتعلق بمشيئته. Pay attention to this. The ones that are attributes related to the actions of Allah are the ones that are connected to Allah's will. Allah's will. In other words, if He wants to, He does it. And if He doesn't want to, He doesn't do it. They're connected to Allah's will, and based on what He wants to do, He takes action. What's an example of this? إن شاء فعلها وإن شاء لم يفعلها. If He wants to do it, He does it. If He doesn't want to do it, He doesn't do it. كالاستواء على العرش والمجيء, such as settling upon the throne. Allah Azza wa Jal at some point decided to settle upon the throne, so He settled upon the throne. Allah Azza wa Jal told us that He will come on the day of judgment with the angels rank after rank. He will come on the day of judgment rank after rank. He will come with the angels on the day of judgment, and they will be in ranks and files. This is called an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is fi'liyah, that is related to Allah's actions. Now the Shaykh goes on to mention something that may be questioned in some of our minds. What if it contains both descriptions? He says, وَرُبَّمَا تَكُونُ الصِّفَةَ ذَاتِيَّةً فِعْلِيَّةً. Perhaps a particular attribute seems to be ذاتية, but فعلية, and at the same time it appears to be an attribute of the self, and at the same time it appears to be something that Allah chooses to do when He wants and refrains from doing when He doesn't want. Then he gives an example. He says, كَالْكَلَامِ, like speaking. Like speaking. He explains. He says, فإنه باعتبار أصل الصفة صفة ذاتية لأن الله لم يزل ولا يزال متكلم. وباعتبار أحد الكلام صفة فعلية لأن الكلام متعلق بمشيئته يتكلم بما شاء متى شاء. When you consider the basis, the foundation of this particular attribute of Allah, then you can clearly see that it is an attribute of the self. In other words, if you were asked the same two questions that we asked earlier, you would have the exact same answer. When did Allah Azza wa Jal begin speaking? When did Allah acquire the ability to speak? You will say Allah has forever been able to speak. When will it end? It will never end. In other words, it is an attribute, a description of Allah Jalla wa Ala that is eternally attached to Him. Allah has forever existed and will forever exist, and this particular attribute of His has always been His attribute, His description. When you consider the basis or the foundation of this attribute, this is what you come up with. Right? But when you consider the events, the incidents, the instances of speaking, then you can clearly see that it is also what? Based on choice. For He only speaks when He wants to speak. And He says what He wants to say. Jalla wa ala. So the scholars, when talking about this, they say it is ذاتية فعلية. ذاتية فعلية. It's an attribute of both the self and the actions. Both together are descriptions of this type of attribute from the attributes of Allah Jalla wa ala. There's another term that the people of knowledge use to describe this type of attribute, a class of attributes. And if you see it, you should immediately identify it as this particular thing that Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen is explaining. And that term that they use is, they say, قديمة النوع حادثة الآحاد. قديمة النوع حادثة الآحاد. قديمة النوع is a reference to having an eternal type. The type is eternal. Allah has always been described with. Hadisatul ahad, having reoccurring instances. In other words, it occurs instance after instance. Just like we mentioned right now with speaking, Allah speaks, and then He speaks again, and then He speaks again, instance after instance after instance. Fine. If this is clear, we can move on to branch number 4. الفرع الرابع. Clear to proceed, or we have something that we want to spend more time with? قديمة النوع حادثة الآحاد. قديمة النوع حادثة الآحاد. Should I repeat what we just discussed, or we are good to go? Branch number 4. كل صفة من صفات الله فإنه يتوجه عليها 3 أسئلة. Every attributes from the attributes of Allah can be tackled with 3 questions. Here the Shaykh, may Allah have mercy upon him, is making us think about these 3 questions in order to help us gain a thorough understanding of this principle. Why are these questions being asked? For the student to benefit a thorough understanding of these principles. السؤال الأول: هل هي حقيقية ولماذا? Question number 1. Are these attributes real? Or if you wish, are these attributes literal or figurative? And why? Question number 2. هل يجوز تكييفها ولماذا? Is it permissible for us when discussing, contemplating, or talking about these attributes to liken them to a specific description, to deem them similar to a specific description? And why? Why do you answer the way that you answer? Is it permissible? Yes or no? And why? Question number 3. هل تماثل صفات المخلوقين ولماذا? Are these attributes of Allah identical to the attributes of His creation? And why? Whether you answer yes or you answer no, answer the second or the follow-up question, which is why. The answer to question number 1: yes, these attributes are literal. They're not figurative. They are intended exactly as understood from the Arabic language. Why? Because the default is that speech is literal. We never leave the literal meaning and interpretation of speech. We go to a different definition of the speech unless we have evidence requiring us to do so. Given that there's no evidence that requires us to reinterpret, to move past the literal meaning and to look for a hidden meaning of the attributes of Allah, given the lack of evidence, it would become impermissible and a crime to do so. Question number 2, the answer for it is: it is impermissible to give a specific description of the attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal, meaning in the absence of additional text. This is what the Shaykh means, in the absence of additional text. Why? Because Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا, and they do not encompass Him in knowledge. In other words, if Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that He has a hand. That's an attribute, right? ذاتية خبرية, as we mentioned earlier when we talked about categorization, right? Someone says to you, give me the details. I want the details of the hand. We say the details of the hand are beyond our capability as humans to give you this kayfiyya. How does Allah have a hand? What's the hand like? We don't know. The only thing we can add is based on text. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the hearts are between two fingers of the fingers of Allah, and he did like this in front of the Sahaba ﷺ. And then he said he turns them how he wants. Allah turns the hearts how he wants. We ask Allah Jalla wa Ala to keep our hearts firm upon His deen. Based on this additional text, we can say, well, the one thing I can tell you about the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah has fingers. At least two. At least two fingers. I can also tell you about the hands of Allah Azza wa Jal is that they extend. His two hands are extended. So Allah extends His hands. I can tell you these additional details by what? By text. Besides that, it would be impermissible for any human to give additional detail about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because we cannot encompass Allah in Allah. This is the answer to the second question. The Shaykh gave one more reason. He says because the human mind is incapable of encompassing the attributes of Allah. Now, I see that the time has kind of caught up with us. We're almost coming up on 1 hour. But we're almost done with the introduction. Should we keep going or should we save it for one more session? I'm going to kind of hold a vote right now and see what the brothers and sisters want to do. Do you want to keep going? Maybe we could wrap up in about 10 minutes, maybe a tiny little bit more than 10 minutes. Can we handle an additional 10 minutes, inshallah? The answer to the third question. See what our brothers say also. And we're clear to proceed. The answer to the third question. لا تماثل صفات المخلوقين. There is no identical similarity between this, the attributes of Allah, and the attributes of the creation. This is the answer to what? The third question. Why? Because Allah said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing like unto Him. There's nothing like unto Him. So if there's nothing like unto Allah, then none of His attributes is similar to the attributes of anything else. Just as He is unique, His attributes are unique. He Himself is unique. There's no existence that is equal to the existence of Allah. Do you know anything else besides Allah that has forever existed? This is a question for the brothers and sisters. Are you aware of anything else besides Allah that has forever existed and will forever continue to exist? Right. All those who said no, this is impossible, this is correct. This is the correct answer. His existence is unique, and as such, His attributes must also be unique. And here's a principle. If you want to memorize this principle, it solves a lot of problems when dealing with issues of aqidah, especially the things that are being debated by the innovators. Memorize this principle if you can. قال أهل العلم الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. See if you can memorize this. الكلام في الذات الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. One more time. الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. Speaking about the attributes is a branch of speaking about self. In other words, whatever you say about Allah Himself is going to be what you say about His attributes. Let's put this into practice. We mentioned how this is very important when it comes to dealing with the issues that are being brought by the innovators, right? Let's say the innovators present an issue and they say we take issue with describing Allah Azza wa Jal with having hands. Why? They say because now you're making Allah similar to the creation. We say, okay, pause. We have a principle. الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. What do you say about Allah himself? Does he exist? Of course Allah exists. We're not going to tell you that Allah does not exist. Jameel. Is his existence proof that he's similar to the creation? They say no. His existence is unique. It is befitting of his majesty and his greatness. An existence that is not like the existence of any besides him. We say to them what? Our answer to you regarding Allah's hands is your answer to us regarding his existence. Whatever you say to justify his existence is what we say to justify that we believe when Allah tells us he has hands. Does this make sense? Is this clear? Hi, ikhwan. Can we repeat the Arabic? Yes, we can repeat the Arabic. الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. And obviously, we can also go back to the recording. You're going to see that I repeated it multiple times, so you can write it down. Now, Sheikh said, لأن الله مستحق للكمال الذي لا غاية فوقه فلا يمكن أن يماثل المخلوق لأنه ناقص. Because Allah is deserving of the ultimate perfection, above which there is no limit that can be reached, then it follows that it is impossible for Allah to be identical to the creation, because the creation by default is lacking, is flawed, is deficient. By default, if you liken the perfect to the imperfect, then you've stated that the perfect is no longer perfect. Just logic. This is how the sound mind operates. Shaykh Jazakallah khairan, let's put it in very succinct terms, very short, to the point. Sound mind cannot debate this. Now, the Shaykh makes a very important distinction here. This is actually an important distinction. You want to learn this. If you intend on advancing in the sciences of Aqidah, this distinction comes in handy. If you plan on studying further in the sciences of Aqidah, this distinction is important to you specifically. الفرق بين التمثيل والتكييف. Differentiation between, the difference between التمثيل والتكييف. By the way, I see that one of us has put the principle that I just mentioned, الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. May Allah reward them for their effort, making things easy for their brothers and sisters. Change على to عن. Change على to عن. Instead of على, put عن. الكلام في الصفات فرع عن الكلام في الذات. Let's modify it that way. Right. The difference between تمثيل and تكييف. تمثيل, the Shaykh explains, ذكر كيفية الصفة مقيدة بمماثل. To give the specific details of the attribute by attaching that attribute to the details of the one that we are likening Allah to. An example of this is when some of the innovators, they say that Allah has hands like my hands. He's connecting the attributes of Allah's details to the details of his attributes. This is an innovation. This is misguidance manifest directly in opposition to the Quran, because Allah said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. There is nothing like unto him. This is tamtheel. When the attributes' details are linked directly to the details of the attributes of the creation. This is tamtheel. Right. What about takif? ذكر كيفية الصفة غير مقيدة بمماثل. By mentioning the details of Allah's attributes, unlinked to any particular details of an attribute found in a creation. In other words, if they start talking about things that are imaginable, only found in the mind, there's nothing like this in the world that we observe around us. They say, well, Allah's description must be like this and must be like that. And they start conjuring things from their minds, things that are impossible to exist in real life. This is called takeef. This is called using your mind to add the details, the missing details. This is haram. Why? Because Allah told us, they cannot encompass him in knowledge. No matter how far you let the mind sail, you will never happen upon the true description of Allah. Even though you have not linked the description of Allah to the creation, these people have still fallen into the sin of takeef. Both are a sin. And tamthil is a type of takeef, limited type of takeef. But takeef is not always tamthil. Like, Shaykh gave an example. He said, an example of tamthil is a person saying, the hand of Allah is like the hand of a human. It's a tamthil. He gave an example of a takeef. He said, takeef, that he imagines a specific description of the hand of Allah, although that particular description is not found amongst the creation. Is not found amongst the creation. This type of imagination is impermissible. Finally, the fourth principle. What do we respond to the mu'attila with? How do we respond to the mu'attila? Mu'attila is a general term. Mu'attila is a general term. It comes from a ta'til. Ta'til. In the Arabic language, the word aatil has multiple meanings. One of them is when you say that this doesn't have any specific description or attribute. In other words, let me give you an example. If a woman's neck is described as a jeed, and then they say jeedun aatil. Jeedun aatil. Neck, jeed, that is aatil. What does this mean? It means that she's not wearing any jewelry around her neck. There's no ornamentation. There's no specific thing to beautify. So a ta'til, it comes in the language of being left, being abandoned, not being adorned, not being used. Allah Azza wa Jalla said, وَبِئْرٍ مُعَطَّلَةٍ قَصْرٍ مَشِيدٍ. In the Quran, He mentioned an abandoned well, and He called it what? مُعَطَّلَةٍ. This is the default from the origin, the linguistic origin from which the word comes. This tells us that the common trait of the mu'attila is they leave Allah Azza wa Jal without description. In other words, they reject, they refuse all the descriptions of Allah, or some, depending on which category and which type of people of innovation we are dealing with. The Shaykh defines them. المعطلة هم الذين ينكرون شيئا من أسماء الله. They are the ones that deny some of the names of Allah. أو صفاته, or His attributes. ويحرفون النصوص عن ظاهرها. They reinterpret the texts in a way that is not in line with what is apparent from them. They're also called the mu'awwila. Sometimes they are mu'awwila because they reinterpret the texts. Obviously, some of them outright reject the texts. Now, the extremists from among them, they reject even the names of Allah. Those who are less extreme, they reject the attributes of Allah. In other words, some of them, they accept the names, but names devoid of meanings. The extremists reject even the names of Allah Jalla wa Ala. The Shaykh said, القاعدة العامة فيما نرد به عليهم أن نقول إن قولهم خلاف ظاهر النصوص. The general principle by which we refute them is to say, indeed, their speech is contrary to the apparent meaning as understood by the Arabic language of the texts of the revelation. Number one. Number two, وخلاف طريقة السلف, and contrary to the methodology of those who have preceded us in righteousness, يعني the Sahaba and the Tabi'un and Atba'u Tabi'un. They did not deal with the texts the way they are dealing with the texts. They have an entirely innovative methodology and approach. The Sahaba never thought even coming near applying this type of understanding to the text. On the contrary, Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to understand from the texts that which is commonly understood by the people of the language from their own language. Number three, وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ دَلِيلٌ صَحِيحٌ. They have no evidence to back up their approach. Why they treat the texts of the Quran and the Sunnah pertaining to Allah's names and attributes this way. In other words, they have innovated this methodology. It is completely conjured up out of thin air with no evidence to back it up, no methodology of the Sahaba that they have inherited, and also no linguistic reason to do so. Because the language, from what is apparent from it, indicates other than what they are saying. Then he goes on to say, وَرُبَّمَا يَكُونُ فِي بَعْضِ الصِّفَاتِ وَجْهٌ رَابِعٌ أو أكثر. And when it comes to certain attributes of Allah, you're going to find a fourth way to refute them, or perhaps even more. In other words, the aforementioned three are suitable refutations for every innovation they come up with. When it comes to the names and attributes of Allah Ta'ala, you can say to them, linguistically, the language does not agree with what you're saying. Number two, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and the Tabi'un and the Atba' Tabi'in, they never approached the text the way you're approaching it, and they never said about it what you are saying about it. And number three, you have no evidence, no sound evidence by which to back up your claims. And with this, we have concluded the commentary on the fourth principle and final principle of قواعد هامة في الأسماء والصفات by Sheikh Muhammad ibn Salih ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah ta'ala. I believe that we have pushed the limits of the time, so inshallah we're going to perhaps take the questions at a later time, or maybe even post them in the chat on Telegram for those who have questions from their brothers and sisters. جزاكم الله جميعا خيرا وبارك الله فيكم ونفعني وإياكم بما نقول ونسمع. اللهم نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنبنا كله دقه وجله علانيته وسره. اللهم كن لنا ولا تكن علينا واهدنا ويسر هدانا إلينا وانصرنا على من بغى علينا. اللهم إنا نسألك في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.